Hi friends, welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since I've uploaded a video, but this one should be pretty special, so I hope it makes up for the long hiatus I've been on. I've been inspired lately by doll customizing channels on YouTube, and it reminded me of the customization attempt I made about 3 years ago. Using a tiny Tempest Shadow doll, I sculpted on a different hairstyle and painted it to look like my husband's Ponysona Antares. It was a very small doll, so I've always wanted to try something a little bit bigger, and I thought that it would be just perfect if I could find a My Little Pony toy with rooted hair that was approximately 6 inches tall, and what do you know, I found exactly what I was looking for on Amazon. It's called the Ultimate Equestria Collection and is such a big set that it barely even fits in a frame here. It comes with 9 ponies, including the main 6 and the 3 princesses, and even a little Spike toy as well. But here it is, quite a lovely set if I do say so myself. So after struggling with the packaging, I finally managed to squeeze the ponies out of the box for a closer look. Like I said, we have the 3 princesses here, and these ones even come with removable crowns. Each pony comes with long, rooted hair, which I wanted specifically so that it would be easy to remove. The hair feels like it's decent quality, so it's probably worth saving if you're someone who reroots dolls, but for my purposes, I don't think I'll be needing it. As expected, the only articulation in these dolls comes from the neck, which allows the head to look left and right. Ideally, I'll keep the neck articulation in my custom figures, but I'm sure there are several in my future that will have no choice but to look only straight ahead. After unboxing the whole set, I was left with a modest stock of ponies for customizing, and they'll come in very handy for future videos. But here's the thing, this isn't the only set I've gotten my hands on since I discovered it. In this box here, I have one more set of brand new ponies, but I also have this little white box full of the same set of ponies, but used. This one was sourced and purchased as a gift for me by my mom after I showed her the Amazon set and mentioned that I was interested in finding a cheaper used set. This set is obviously well loved, and it's missing a couple of the ponies from the original set, but the ones that are here are still perfectly usable. Basically all of them have super matted hair, so for these ones especially, I'm not gonna save it. This one also has a small brown smudge on the face here that I'll need to clean off. It has even worse stains and smudges on the opposite side, but we'll go through them a little bit more in a moment. For now, I figure I'll throw everyone new and used into the stock box for later use, and I should have more than enough to keep me busy for a little while. For this project in particular, I've chosen to begin with the Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy dolls from the used set. Both have quite tangled and matted hair, which wouldn't be a big issue normally and could potentially be fixed, but in this case I noticed some sort of greasy residue coming off on my fingers when I touched it, so I felt more than comfortable simply throwing that out. I grabbed my little pink flamingo scissors and started to cut off all the hair, making it as short as possible. The tail is easy enough, but the mane is rooted in 2 lines down the back of the neck, so for best access I just twisted the head backwards. I cut it down both sides at once for this one, but I really should have done it one at a time to ensure as close a cut as possible. It doesn't really matter though, because I was able to trim it down again after the big chop. After twisting the head back in place and taking in the view of a newly buzzed Fluttershy, it was time to apply the same treatment to Rainbow Dash. Again, cut off the tail and follow up with the mane. This time I learned my lesson a little though, and I cut 1 row of plugs at a time instead of trying to get both in one swipe. And after her trim, I took them both to the sink and washed them with soap and water. I was able to get a lot of the dirt and weird greasy residue off of them, but they both still had stains and smudges that the soap wouldn't touch, so I made plans to save them for the next step. I wanted to see if I would be able to go into the heads to remove their hair plugs from the inside, but no matter how hard I pulled on the head, it did not want to come off. I was afraid of breaking something irreversibly and compromising the neck articulation, so I ended up just abandoning the idea altogether. I just ended up dealing with the buzz cuts in a different way. Because I couldn't get the heads off, I just went ahead to the next step of the process. So I got myself a handful of Q-tips and a bottle of pure acetone. Starting with Fluttershy and a handful of paper towels as well, I briefly wet the towel and then pressed it to the eye of the doll. I held it there for a few moments before twisting and removing much of the eye in one motion. Creepy! I followed up with another round of acetone and took care of the remaining smudges with some Q-tips. Luckily, the acetone took care of many of the smudges and stains that the soap and water didn't touch, but not all of them. I didn't worry too much about the stains though, since I knew I would be painting the ponies anyway later on. But I repeated this process on the other side of the face with a little less success than the first eye, and then used a Q-tip to remove the cutie mark. For some reason, these dolls only come with cutie marks printed on one side, but I suppose that just makes the step a little bit easier on me. The same process was repeated on the Rainbow Dash doll with the addition of the removal of some random pink smudges here and there. I believe the child who had these before me must have tried to give them makeovers with nail polish. Luckily, nail polish comes right off with a little bit of acetone. After removing the paint and giving them one more wash with soap and water, both ponies were cleaned, fully prepped, and ready to be made over. For this video, I chose to do 2 at once so that I can remake the old Antares doll on a bigger base, but also let him have his spouse this time, my Sona, ArtSong. Look, blind and bald, and they like each other already. The first step I need to do before I can really begin the makeover is sanding. The dolls aren't perfectly glossy smooth or anything, and I'm sure paint would stick to them, but sanding just gives me the extra assurance that nothing will come peeling or flaking off later in the process. I bought these sanding blocks from Amazon that ranged from coarse to fine, and I started with the coarsest one. It really didn't make a lot of difference in the texture of the plastic, but it did change a little, and it was enough that I felt comfortable with the idea of painting it later on. The scratches on the surface are very fine, but any more than this might have been too much for the future paint coat to cover, so I just went with it. I really just sanded until the surface of the doll looked to be a little bit more matte than it had been before. Once they were all sanded, it was finally time to get my hands dirty and begin the process of transforming the dolls. For this project, I purchased Das brand clay. I've worked with it before, so I knew that this one would be a good one to start with just because I have experience. But I also bought this brand of paper clay meant specifically for making models and dolls as specified on the back of the package. I bought it as a backup to use when my DOS clay finally ran out, so I won't be using it this time, but I thought I'd show it here just to make it known what products I have at my disposal. And now we'll say goodbye to my countertop and replace it with this silicone mat. This will protect my countertop from paint, clay, and glue, and will keep any mess contained so it won't be a hassle to clean up when I'm done. I then got myself a bowl of water and, of course, the clay. This clay can be a bit strange to work with if you're not familiar with it. It has an unusually paint-like smell, and it's sort of fibrous in texture. I think it's sort of similar to a papier-mâché paste, maybe, which is why I'm tempted to call this paper clay, but I'm not sure if it actually is. As far as I know, it's just your regular air-dry clay, at least that's what the packaging says. But finally, we're ready to begin. I started off by adding a clump to the front of Fluttershy's face on top of the muzzle. Stallions in the show and in my art style are shown to have a significantly more square face shape than mares, so I'm just doing my best to turn this mare into a stallion. Water can be rubbed onto the surface of this clay with a finger to smooth away lumps or fingerprints, and to blend the clay into the plastic more seamlessly. After shaping it as well as I could, I set it aside to dry while I worked on the other one. Because I don't need to change the face shape for this doll, I went right to the hair. Like I said before, I couldn't remove the plugs from the inside, but I eventually started to consider that kind of a plus. The clay manes would need something to anchor onto, and I figured that the short little plugs of hair would make for excellent anchors, so I mashed a little clay right up into the plugs and did my best to cover them most of the way. I wasn't too concerned with covering them all from the beginning because I knew that the sculpted locks of hair would cover anything that was still peeking out. After the first pass of clay in the mane, I got out a roll of armature wire. I measured out the length that I wanted for the tail and then doubled it so that I could twist the wire around itself and make for a stronger tail support. I repeated the step for both ponies and then shoved the wire through the hole where the tail was rooted. This shoved the little root into the body and left a hole empty for the wire to sit in. I anchored it down with a little bit of clay and then did the same process for the length of Antares' future ponytail. Using my tiny scissors, I poked a hole into the head where I wanted the ponytail to come out, and I made sure that the wire fit well enough inside. And finally, I moved on to sculpting the first locks of hair for ArtSong's bangs. I simply took little balls of clay, rolled them into snakes in my hand, and then made sure to taper at least one of the two ends. Then, using water to secure it in place, I laid it on the head and bent it into the proper shape. I chose to go with clay over re-rooting for several reasons. The first reason being that it's cheaper to just paint over clay than it is to buy all the different colors and dyes that you'd need for doll hair, but also because ponies tend to have very distinctive hairstyles and they'd be much easier to replicate in clay than with doll hair. I know that yarn hair can be persuaded to stay in specific shapes more easily than nylon hair, for example, but I thought that sculpting it would be an even easier choice than yarn. After finishing ArtSong's first layer of bangs, I repeated the process on Antares, with the additional step of making sure the hole in the head would still comfortably fit the wire armature later on. Antares has a much different hairstyle to ArtSong, so while the first doll had hair that went mainly forward, Antares' bangs swoop off to one side of the face. I allowed that layer of clay to dry overnight, and then in the morning I came back in with a sanding block. The sanding didn't end up being incredibly helpful, but it sanded off the random fingerprints that I forgot to smooth away, so it was a reasonably important step. Then I took a little bit of super glue and dabbed it on with a toothpick to secure this layer of hair to the plastic. I wasn't incredibly worried about the hair staying secure by itself because I knew I'd be coming back in with glue throughout the process. I secured the tails down with a little bit of super glue as well. After the glue dried, I went back in to do another layer of hair. I was just adding volume and thickness to the bangs at this point. I waited until the first layer dried because, as I'll learn the hard way later on in this video, multiple times, there's nothing worse than sculpting something beautifully only to smash it while adding more details somewhere else. One of the most distinct features of ArtSong's mane, in my opinion, is the curly locks of hair that poke out from behind each ear. I was careful to keep the head turned as I sculpted these so that the wings wouldn't end up getting in the way or smashing the wet clay. I did only one of the curls for now and waited until this new layer of clay was dry before I went on to do the opposite curl. And then, because I wanted a better angle at ArtSong's curl, I set her on her face. Of course, I immediately realized my mistake and picked her back up, only to realize that I had ruined the little pointy curl at the end of her bangs. I was very disappointed. That was the first of the lessons that I learned this video. So I did my best to fix it, but it didn't come out exactly the same way as it was the first time. Once I was happy with my progress, I set it aside to dry while I worked some more on Antares. I went through the same process, adding thickness and volume to the mane so that it would be a close match to the way that it looks in drawings. And once again, once this layer was complete, I set it aside to dry overnight once more. When they were dry, I went in and added another touch of super glue off camera, only to discover when I came back that the glue had dripped everywhere. Not to worry though, since I have a Dremel at my disposal for this project. Carefully using my various attachments, I sanded off all of the strings and lumps left behind by the glue, and I used it to ever so gently do some additional shaping to the dried clay locks. After all the excess glue was sanded away, I went in with another round of clay to add in ArtSong's other curl on the side of the face. Trying to play it safe with her this time, I stopped there and moved on to Antares. I made sure the ponytail armature still fit into the back of the head before I began to coat it in a rough layer of clay, and then sculpt the back portion of the mane. Because all the hair is pulled into a high ponytail, I sculpted all of the locks going upwards towards the hole in the head. After drying, I applied another layer of super glue and followed up once again with the Dremel to remove any new strings or clumps. Once I was happy with that, I began to sculpt the ponytail itself. Antares has very long, wavy hair, so I tried my best to show that in the way that his ponytail hangs on the back of his head. I also went ahead and began sculpting the back of ArtSong's mane as well. Her hair is very short and spiky in the back, so it was pretty simple to make all of the locks point upwards. And finally finished with the manes, I moved on to the tails. Knowing that I would have to layer the tails, I began at the bottom, sculpting on some short locks that could be blended into the rest of the tail later. These would also serve as supports and anchors for the future locks to hold on to as well. After this round of clay had dried, I went through and added some touch-ups and finishing locks to the manes, and then continued with my work on the tails. Again, I started with the locks closest to the bottom of the tail and worked my way upwards. The tails were significantly more difficult than the manes, but I think it's because they're so much larger in size and therefore easier to make look imperfect. But it's also because you're sculpting against gravity even more so with the tails than with the manes. I think if I'd gone the rerouting route, then the tails would have actually been the easiest part by far. Throughout the sculpting process, I took some very thinned, soft pieces of clay and I used a paintbrush to gently push them into the cracks between each lock of dried hair. I did this mainly to fill in the deep holes and cracks between the pieces because I thought that the gaps made it look a little creepy and unsettling, but it came with the added bonus of a little extra strength holding each lock in place. I did this all over the manes and tails as I went, and I think it greatly improved the appearance of the sculpted hair. Despite the tails being the most challenging in execution, they're the simplest in description, so there's not much else I have to say about this portion. Sculpt from the bottom up, fill in the cracks with thin clay, let it dry, and repeat again until the whole tail is full and strong. A little later on, I sculpted on the elastic band securing Antares' ponytail. It ended up getting blended in on the bottom, so it's a little hard to tell exactly what it is, but for a simple detail like this, I'm sure it's just fine. After one more round of dremeling off camera, I brushed a little bit more clay into the cracks as a final finishing touch. Once all the sculpting was finally completely finished, dried, and sanded, I went in with a wet paper towel and wiped off as much of the clay from the bodies as I could. I just used water and nothing else just so I could try and remove a little bit of the dust. Now, at long last, it's time for painting. Because these are original characters, it was very unlikely that I would find the correct paint colors straight out of the bottle, so I spent a little while mixing up all the colors I thought I would need. I started with the red for Antares' mane, and the brown of ArtSong's coat. Later on, I would also mix up the pink gradient for Antares' mane, as well as the gray for his coat and for ArtSong's mane. I began the painting process by adding the red to Antares' mane. His mane is mostly black, but with red streaks that fade to pink at the tips. Because his colors only appear in stripes, I just put the red in the places where I thought the stripes would look best. After the red had dried, I went in with my pre-mixed pink and began to create the gradient in his hair. I kept one brush specifically for the pink, but another brush so that I could dip it into both colors, as well as some water, to ensure smooth blending for the gradient. I should have done the gradient before the red had dried, but I hadn't thought that far ahead in the process yet when I began to paint him. It took some finagling, but I managed to get the gradient to a point where I was happy with it. After that, I moved on to ArtSong's hair. She has a single gray stripe between the black portions of her hair, so I added a gray stripe down the center of the sculpture. Coincidentally, the gray of her mane exactly matches Antares' coat, so I would be able to reuse this custom color for him later on as well. After several coats of each of these colors, I went in with the black. I just used the black straight out of the bottle for this portion. When I draw them, I don't use actual black, but a dark gray that I can add shading to. Since this isn't a drawing though, I figured straight black would work just fine, and I like the way it came out. ArtSong's hair was simple enough since she only has one stripe down the center, but Antares was a little more challenging due to his streaks. I just went through and added the streaks in where I thought it would look the most natural, and reminded myself that any mistakes could always be touched up later on. After several coats and a few touch-ups, this is what the finished hair looked like. I was pretty happy with it for the most part, so I was ready to move on to painting their coats. I reused ArtSong's gray for Antares' coat, like I said I would before, and went over all of his body. Neither of these characters have any body markings, so they'd be a breeze for this next step. After Antares had one full coat, I moved on to repeat the same process for ArtSong. Both characters would end up needing multiple coats of paint, which I completed off camera. It's amazing how important the coat color is. Up until this point, both my husband and I agreed that these dolls didn't look at all that accurate to their characters, but the moment the paint coat went on, they were unmistakably ArtSong and Antares. I had some doubts about how this project would turn out, but once I saw them with their coat colors painted on, I knew it would turn out just fine. This is definitely one of those trust the process kinds of projects. After all their coats of paint had fully dried, I went in with a pencil so that I could sketch in the details of their faces. I carefully drew in the outlines for where I'd like their eyes to go, and I outlined where Antares' 5 o'clock shadow would go in later. Once the sketching was done, I went in with my white paint and began to fill in the shape of the eyes. I got a little paint onto the hair and in places that it otherwise shouldn't have been, but I'd just go back and touch it up one more time after the eyes were finished. Again, each eye took several coats of paint before I was able to go back and add the irises. I went ahead and sketched out the cutie marks on each flank like I had before on the faces. Like I mentioned earlier, the original dolls had cutie marks only on one side, but I personally prefer there to be marks on both flanks, so I went ahead and tried to mirror the marks on each side. Once those were sketched in, I went ahead and started to paint them in. Antares' cutie mark is a little red Saturn with a pink ring, so I added the red circle for the planet on each side, and then just used the same color to paint in his irises. For ArtSong's irises, I was able to just use a green straight out of the bottle, which saved me a little time and effort. I painted in her eyes and added several coats before I went and began to paint more of Antares' cutie mark. I used the same pink from his hair to add the ring to his little planet on each side. And then I went back to ArtSong to begin filling in the cutie mark as well. Her mark is a music note with a paintbrush crossing through. I started with the black of the music note, being as slow and careful as possible so I could make it look neat and tidy from the beginning. Once the black was dry, I went in with red to add the handle of her paintbrush, and then I added the brown of the bristles. At this point, I moved back onto Antares so that I could add a few lighter streaks of color in his eyes like they do in the show. I mixed up a lighter shade starting from the red of his mane and added it to the middle edge of each iris. The same process was repeated for ArtSong's eyes as well. After all those coats of paint and details had dried, I finally went in and began to add eyelashes and the pupils to each pony. Using my thinnest brush, I was very, very careful to paint smoothly curved lines around each eye. It was hard to keep my hands from shaking, but I managed to get it finished without any major mistakes. And while I was at it, I went ahead and added the pupils. After allowing these details to dry, I went in and began to touch up the edges around the cutie marks and the eyes, making extra sure that everything was clean and neat as could be. Once I had finished that, I finally added the highlights to each eye. I started with a large highlight on the right and a small highlight to the left, and I made especially sure not to mirror the position on the opposite side. This way, no matter which direction they were facing, the light would always be reflected from the same direction. And this way, I'd even be able to allow them to face each other and their eyes would both show the correct highlight direction. After all this had finished, I went in and added Antares' 5 o'clock shadow. I used the same gray of his coat but with a drop of black to make it just a few shades darker. And now, at the very end of the process, I made a horrible mistake. I'd been holding the ponies by their tails this entire time, assuming they were strong enough to handle it, but I was wrong. ArtSong's tail cracked and began to came off. I tried to patch it with just a few brushfuls of paint, but obviously that wouldn't be strong enough to keep it sturdy forever, so I carefully added a touch of super glue, making extra sure not to leave any excess. Remembering the drips and clumps that the glue made in the mains before, I didn't want anything excess to ruin the paint job I had already put on the doll. Luckily enough though, the glue didn't create any strings and I was very pleased with the result. I added a little bit more paint on the cracks left behind and after that it was all good as new. So finally, I was ready to apply my varnish. I bought a matte spray varnish meant for going over acrylic paints and I set up the ponies on the table of my balcony. I was nervous that the finish might not behave since it instructed me to apply it at room temperature, but at the time of filming this, it was 34 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Because of this, I left them out on the balcony for just long enough for the varnish to dry to the touch before I brought them back inside and left them to dry for a day at room temperature. The varnish ended up not being perfectly matte as I'd hoped, but in a stroke of luck, I actually ended up liking the ever so slightly shiny finish that it gave the ponies. It mattified the black paint, but added just a little bit of shine to the coats, and I thought it made the final products look really nice. So, happy with the varnish, I added just one last finishing step. Using DuraClear's glossy varnish, I applied a few coats to the eyes to make them shine, and with that, the project was complete! These two took me a little over a week to complete, and I ended up with 12 hours of footage. It was a really fun process, but I'll definitely be trying to do only one pony at a time from here on out. 2 at once can be kinda brutal. I'm sure I'll tackle a few more 2-in-1 projects like this in the future, but for now I'll just hope that I toned it down for future videos. My husband and I have no shortage of pony OCs in need of sculptures, so I'll have plenty of characters to make from here on out. I hope you all enjoyed the video. I'll definitely make more dolls when I can, but for now I hope this has been a good comeback from my channel. Thank you all so much for watching and for sticking around during my hiatus. I'll see you all in the next one!